Matthew Harris, a wealthy man in his late 70s, sat in his silver Mercedes, tapping his thumb impatiently on the wheel as the Florida sun blazed. The air conditioning hummed but offered little relief. His flat tire left him stranded, and for the first time in years, his wealth and status couldn't help. Calls for roadside assistance failed. This rural road had no signal. Leaning back in his seat, Matthew sighed deeply. He was not used to waiting or feeling powerless. Just as frustration began to simmer within him, he spotted a figure walking toward him down the road. It was a boy, maybe 14 or 15, carrying an old backpack. He wore a faded t-shirt, dusty jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. As the boy got closer, Matthew noticed he was a black teenager, his calm demeanor contrasting with the heat. The boy approached with a polite smile. "Got a flat, sir?" he asked, steady and friendly. Matthew hesitated, taken aback by the boy's ease. "Yes, no signal out here to call for help," he replied, gesturing toward his phone. The boy nodded knowingly. "I can help with that," he said, kneeling beside the tire without waiting. "My grandpa showed me how to fix a flat last summer. Do you have a spare?" Matthew gestured to the trunk. The boy opened it, pulled out the tools and spare tire, and got to work. His movements were quick and sure, hands working with practiced confidence. Matthew watched, feeling a strange mix of relief and curiosity. This wasn't the kind of confidence that came from money or privilege. It was something deeper. When the job was done, the boy wiped his hands on his jeans. "All set," he said with a small smile. Matthew reached into his wallet, pulling out crisp bills. "Here, take this. You've earned it," he said, holding out the money. But the boy stepped back, raising a hand. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. I'm just happy to help." For a moment, Matthew stood silent, the bills still in his hand. He had met countless people in his life, business partners, employees, investors, but nearly every interaction involved transactions or deals. This was different. As the boy turned and walked down the road, Matthew climbed into his car and watched him through the rearview mirror until his figure disappeared. The encounter stayed with him as he drove home. There was something about the boy, his confidence, his dignity, his willingness to help without expecting anything in return, that Matthew couldn't shake. That night, Matthew sat alone in his study, surrounded by books he rarely opened. The memory of the boy lingered, and for the first time in years, Matthew felt something stir within him. The next morning, Matthew Harris couldn't shake the image of the boy from his mind. It wasn't just the boy's calm confidence or his refusal to accept money. It was something deeper. The boy had chosen to help without hesitation, expecting nothing in return. Who was the boy, and why had he left such an impression? Determined to find answers, Matthew set out in his car. He decided to start on the same road where they had met. The Florida morning was warm, and the rural roads stretched endlessly. Matthew stopped at small diners and gas stations, asking if anyone had seen a young black boy fitting the description. Most people shrugged or shook their heads, but finally an older woman at a roadside cafe smiled when Matthew described the boy. "Sounds like Caleb," she said. "He's always helping folks. Lives with his mom in Fort Myers. Small house near the edge of town." "Fort Myers?" Matthew repeated, making a note. "Thank you." The drive to Fort Myers wasn't long, but it gave Matthew time to think. Caleb had reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years, a connection to something real. Matthew found the house easily. It was a small single-story home with a sagging porch and a wooden fence in need of repair. Taking a deep breath, he knocked lightly on the door. A woman in her early 40s answered. Her dark hair was tied back, and her tired eyes studied Matthew cautiously. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Good morning," Matthew said. "I think I met your son yesterday. Caleb, right? He helped me with a flat tire." Her face softened. "That sounds like Caleb," she said. "He's always helping people." Matthew nodded. "I wanted to thank him, but he wouldn't take anything. I just felt like I needed to meet him again." She stepped aside. "He's out back working on the fence." Inside, the home was modest but cozy. The furniture was mismatched, the walls decorated with family photos. It wasn't fancy, but it felt warm. In the backyard, Caleb was hammering nails into the fence. He looked up, surprised to see Matthew. "Hey, mister," he said. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "You helped me when I needed it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." Caleb shrugged. It wasn't a big deal, but to Matthew it was. He looked at the boy in the yard, noticing the patched fence and the worn swing set. Caleb didn't have much, yet he carried himself with pride and integrity. "I don't think you realize what a big deal it was," Matthew said. People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return. Caleb tilted his head. If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I? He replied simply. Matthew nodded, struck by the boy's simple logic. Caleb's home might have been modest, but the sense of resilience and warmth here was undeniable. Matthew left Caleb's house that day with emotions he hadn't felt in years. The boy had shown him something simple yet profound: kindness without expectation. On the drive home, Matthew's mind raced. He wanted to do something meaningful for Caleb and his family, but he didn't want it to feel like charity. It had to honor the boy's quiet dignity in his family's strength. The next morning, Matthew sat in his study. For years, his wealth had been used for business, but this time, he wanted it to make a real difference. He made a series of calls, reaching out to contractors and suppliers. By midday, the plan was set. 2 days later, a crew of workers arrived at Caleb's house. Matthew stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, directing the team. Caleb and his mother stepped outside, their faces filled with surprise. "What's all this?" Caleb's mother asked cautiously. Matthew smiled. "You've built something strong here, a family, a home. I just want to help make it a little easier." She hesitated before nodding, her expression softening. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know, but I wanted to," Matthew replied. The work began immediately. The crew repaired the porch, reinforced the fence, and replaced the swing set. Inside, they patched walls, polished floors, and updated the small kitchen. Caleb watched in awe as his home was transformed piece by piece. At first, Caleb tried to help, offering to carry tools and planks, but Matthew stopped him. "Your job is to enjoy being a kid for a little while," he said with a smile. Still, Caleb couldn't resist hanging around the workers, asking questions about their tools. One contractor, a man named Joe, noticed Caleb's curiosity and let him assist with small tasks. Caleb's excitement was contagious, and even Matthew found himself smiling more than he had in years. By the end of the week, the house looked completely different. The porch was sturdy and freshly painted, the fence stood tall, and the backyard swing set gleamed in the sunlight. Inside, the home felt brighter and more functional. Neighbors stopped by to admire the changes, bringing small gifts to show their support. On the final day, Caleb stood on the new porch with his mother, looking out at the yard. His smile was wide, his eyes bright with gratitude. "I can't believe this is our house," he said softly. Matthew stood nearby, leaning against the porch railing. "You've got a strong foundation here," he said, gesturing toward Caleb and his mother. "This just builds on that." Caleb turned to Matthew, his voice serious. "Someday I want to do something like this. I want to help people too." Matthew placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You already are, Caleb. Never forget that." As the sun set, the yard was filled with laughter and conversation. Caleb played with his friends, his mother chatted with neighbors, and Matthew watched quietly. His wealth had never felt so purposeful. Surrounded by warmth and connection, Matthew realized the boy had given him far more than he could ever give back. Do you believe kindness without expecting anything in return is still common in today's world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.